One battleship sailed with the promise of breaking the British lifeline in the Atlantic, and within 9 days it carried over 2,000 men to the ocean floor. What turned the most powerful surface raider Germany had into a hunted, crippled wreck hundreds of miles from safety? The answer does not begin with the final battle, but with a single decision made days earlier that sealed everything that followed. In early 1941, the Atlantic War had entered a phase defined by logistics, tonnage, and industrial output rather than by symbolic battleship duels. Germany's strategic position at sea remained structurally weak despite early successes. Between September 1939 and December 1940, German U-boats and surface raiders destroyed approximately 4.2 million gross register tons of Allied shipping, but this figure competed directly with British and American shipbuilding capacity, which together exceeded 8 million tons annually by 1941. Britain remained dependent on maritime supply for food, fuel, and raw materials, importing over 30 million tons of cargo per year. Disruption, not annihilation, was the German naval objective. The German surface fleet had suffered major losses by this stage. The battleship Admiral Graf Spee was scuttled in December 1939. The heavy cruiser Blücher was sunk during the invasion of Norway in April 1940. The battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were damaged multiple times and required frequent repairs. The aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin remained unfinished. By mid-1941, Germany possessed only 2 new capital ships with full operational potential, Bismarck and Tirpitz. Of these, only Bismarck was combat-ready in the spring of 1941. Britain, by contrast, retained numerical naval superiority despite heavy losses. In May 1941, the Royal Navy deployed 15 battleships and battlecruisers, 7 aircraft carriers, and over 200 cruisers and destroyers globally. However, this superiority was diluted across multiple theaters, including the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and home waters. German naval planners aimed to exploit this dispersion. The geopolitical context also placed urgency on German operations. The invasion of the Soviet Union was scheduled for late June 1941. Until that point, Britain remained Germany's only active major enemy. High-level German leadership expected that disrupting Atlantic supply lines could weaken British resistance before the opening of the Eastern Front. From March to May 1941, U-boat operations intensified, with 273 Allied merchant ships sunk in March alone, totaling approximately 1.47 million tons. Yet British convoy systems, air patrols, and radar coverage expanded steadily. Public perception played a measurable role. In Germany, large surface ships symbolized technological strength and deterrence, even though their actual strategic utility was limited compared to submarines. The Bismarck displaced 50,900 tons fully loaded, carried 8 380mm main guns, and had a maximum speed of 30.5 knots. Its commissioning in August 1940 was widely publicized. In Britain, the memory of the Battle of Jutland still shaped naval thinking. Control of the North Atlantic remained regarded as a prerequisite for national survival. Intelligence estimates on both sides were uneven. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had partial access to Kriegsmarine communications, but faced gaps due to new cipher procedures introduced in early 1941. German intelligence underestimated British ability to redeploy capital ships rapidly between the Mediterranean and North Atlantic. German Naval Command believed that a fast breakout by Bismarck into the Atlantic could succeed before an effective interception network could be established. Operational limitations also influenced planning. The German Navy lacked overseas bases following the loss of surface raiders' supply ports in France during earlier campaigns. While Brest and Saint-Nazaire were available, their vulnerability to air attack restricted prolonged operations. German surface vessels depended on a limited network of tankers and supply ships scattered across the Atlantic, including the Weisenberg, Spichern, and Belchen, each operating under radio silence. Within the German command structure, authority over naval strategy rested with Grand Admiral Erich Raeder. By April 1941, pressure mounted on him to demonstrate the continued relevance of surface operations. Adolf Hitler remained skeptical of risking capital ships, but approved a limited offensive raid rather than a decisive fleet engagement. The objective was defined narrowly: disrupt convoys, draw off escort forces, and force the redistribution of British naval assets. At the same time, British naval leadership anticipated renewed German surface activity. The destruction of convoy HX-84 by Admiral Scheer in November 1940, where 5 ships totaling 38,000 tons were sunk before interception, had already demonstrated the potential effect of such raids. Continuous patrols were maintained in the Denmark Strait and Iceland-Faroe Passage. The home fleet at Scapa Flow remained on heightened readiness, with Prince of Wales, Hood, King George V, and multiple carrier groups available for rapid deployment. By mid-May 1941, both sides had reached a point where probability, intelligence gaps, and political pressure converged. Germany possessed one fully operational modern battleship capable of Atlantic operations. Britain possessed the surveillance network necessary to detect but not necessarily to immediately destroy it. Supply tonnage, not territorial conquest, defined the strategic currency of the conflict. The conditions were in place for a single surface sortie to force a high-stakes naval confrontation whose outcome could not be controlled once initiated. On 18th of May 1941, Bismarck departed Gotenhafen in the Baltic Sea, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. The 2 ships sailed under the command of Vice Admiral Gunther Lütjens, with overall command of the battleship entrusted to Captain Ernst Lindemann. The operation was designated Rheinübung. The total displacement of the task force exceeded 92,000 tons. Their immediate objective was to reach the North Atlantic via the Danish Straits and begin commerce raiding operations against British supply lines. At the time of departure, Bismarck carried approximately 7,700 tons of fuel oil, while Prinz Eugen carried about 3,200 tons, giving both vessels sufficient range for extended Atlantic operations if replenishment could be secured. The breakout route led northward through the Kattegat and into the Skagerrak. Swedish naval observers detected the German ships on 20th of May near Gotland. This sighting was passed to British intelligence through diplomatic channels and confirmed by aerial reconnaissance within 24 hours. On 21st May, Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft photographed Bismarck and Prince Eugen at anchor in Grimstad Fjord near Bergen, Norway. The ships remained there for less than 20 hours. During this stop, neither vessel fully refueled, largely due to time constraints and concerns over air attack. Bismarck took on approximately 1,000 tons of fuel instead of topping off completely. British Naval Command interpreted the presence of Bismarck in Norway as confirmation of an Atlantic sortie. At Scapa Flow, Admiral John Tovey, commander of the home fleet, ordered multiple task groups to sea. The battlecruiser Hood, displacing 46,680 tons and armed with 8 381mm guns, was assigned to intercept alongside the new battleship Prince of Wales, which had a full load displacement of 43,786 tons and 10 356mm guns. Additional cruiser patrols were deployed across the Denmark Strait and south of Iceland. The carrier Victorious was prepared for possible air operations. On 23 May at 1922 local time, the British heavy cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk detected Bismarck and Prince Eugen in the Denmark Strait using Type 284 radar at a range of approximately 12 nautical miles. The German ships immediately opened fire. At 1930, Bismarck fired 5 salvos at Norfolk at distances exceeding 20 kilometers. Norfolk sustained minor splinter damage but escaped. Suffolk maintained continuous radar contact, transmitting position reports to the British fleet every 30 minutes. During the night of 23-24 May, the shadowing cruisers maintained contact at distances ranging between 10 and 15 kilometers. German attempts to shake off the shadowing force through high-speed maneuvers and course changes proved unsuccessful. Radio silence was broken repeatedly on both sides, allowing British Naval Command to refine interception vectors. At this stage, the British force committed to interception included Hood, Prince of Wales, 6 destroyers, and supporting cruisers. Shortly after 0530 on 24 May, Hood and Prince of Wales closed to visual contact with Bismarck and Prince Eugen at a range of approximately 26 kilometers. Sea state was moderate, with wave heights of 2 to 3 meters. Visibility was partially restricted by low cloud cover. The British force approached on a converging course that exposed Hood and Prince of Wales to near head-on fire, while limiting their ability to bring full broadsides to bear. At 0552, Hood opened fire on Prince Eugen at approximately 6,500 meters, mistakenly identifying it as the lead ship. Prince of Wales followed within seconds, engaging Bismarck. The German ships returned fire almost immediately. After approximately 3 minutes of exchange, at 0557, a 380mm shell from Bismarck penetrated Hood's deck near the after magazines. A massive internal explosion followed. Hood broke in two and sank within 3 minutes. Of the 1,018 officers and crew aboard, 1,015 were killed. 3 survivors were recovered later by British destroyers. Prince of Wales continued firing alone, but sustained 7 confirmed hits within the next 5 minutes, including 3 300mm shells and 4 203mm shells from Prince Eugen. 1 shell disabled a secondary gun battery, another penetrated the bridge area, killing several personnel, including the commander of the gunnery control team. Mechanical failures in several main turrets further reduced its firepower. At 0602, Prince of Wales disengaged under a smokescreen and withdrew at high speed. Bismarck did not emerge unscathed from the engagement. At least 3 confirmed hits from Prince of Wales struck the battleship. 1 shell penetrated the forward fuel tank, causing approximately 1,000 tons of fuel oil to leak into the sea. Another strike damaged a boiler room, reducing maximum speed from 30.5 knots to approximately 28 knots. Oil contamination also produced a visible surface trail, making concealment difficult. Following the battle, Vice Admiral Lutyens faced a strategic decision. The original mission focused on sustained commerce raiding. However, fuel loss, structural damage, and the certainty of continued pursuit altered operational feasibility. At 0730 on 24 May, Lutyens transmitted a radio message to German command stating that Bismarck had been damaged and intended to proceed toward the occupied French coast for repairs. Prinz Eugen was detached and ordered to continue independent raiding operations in the Atlantic. As Prinz Eugen altered course to the southwest, Bismarck turned eastward and then southward toward France at an average speed of 20 to 22 knots. British tracking continued through intermittent radar contact and aerial reconnaissance. The destruction of Hood altered strategic priorities immediately. The Royal Navy initiated a large-scale pursuit operation involving more than 60 warships across multiple task forces. At this point, the operation was no longer a raid, but a focused attempt to locate and destroy the damaged German battleship before it could reach safety. Following the separation of the 2 German ships during the morning of 24 May 1941, the operational logic of both sides shifted from commerce disruption toward concentrated interception and destruction. For the German command, the original objective of sustained Atlantic raiding had effectively collapsed. Bismarck's fuel loss, estimated at over 1,000 tons from the forward bunker alone, reduced its combat radius and endurance. At a cruising speed of 20 knots, remaining usable fuel provided an estimated operational window of less than 4 days before critical depletion. The battleship also suffered a reduction in maximum speed and loss of trim stability due to flooding in forward compartments. German surface strategy at this stage depended on reaching repair facilities on the French Atlantic coast, most realistically at Saint-Nazaire, which possessed the only dry dock capable of handling Bismarck's hull dimensions. The dock at Brest could not accommodate the ship's length of 251 meters. The distance from Bismarck's approximate position south of Iceland to Saint-Nazaire exceeded 1,200 nautical miles. Even under ideal conditions, the transit required no less than 60 hours at sustained medium speed, with no margin for additional damage or prolonged pursuit. German naval planners still maintained a dispersed support network. At least 6 supply ships were positioned across the Atlantic, including Belchen, Lothringen, Spichern, and Esso Hamburg. However, none were positioned along the southern route toward France with sufficient proximity to support emergency refueling. Luftwaffe air cover could only be expected once Bismarck approached, within approximately 300 kilometers of the French coast. Until that point, the battleship remained exposed to carrier-based air attack and surface interception. Vice Admiral Lutyens elected to proceed independently toward France rather than return to Norway. A northern route back through the Denmark Strait risked immediate recontact with superior British forces already mobilized near Iceland. Radio transmissions to German naval headquarters continued despite known British interception capability. These signals confirmed both the intent to reach France and the continued separation from Prince Eugen, which now operated on an independent radar track several hundred kilometers to the west. On the British side, strategic priorities expanded rapidly following Hood's destruction. The Home Fleet assumed full pursuit status under Admiral John Tovey, with direct political pressure transmitted from London. Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued explicit directives that Bismarck was to be destroyed at sea before reaching port. The Royal Navy committed assets across all available theaters. The carrier Victorious, battleships King George V and Rodney, battlecruiser Repulse, and multiple cruiser and destroyer groups were routed into interception corridors between Iceland, Ireland, and western France. British planning relied on continuous tracking to prevent Bismarck from disappearing into the Atlantic. Radar-equipped cruisers, aircraft patrols from Iceland, Northern Ireland, and aircraft carriers, and surface patrol lines across likely transit routes were established. However, night contact on 24-25 May was disrupted when Bismarck successfully executed a temporary evasion maneuver after midnight. At approximately 03 WOS on 25 May, Suffolk lost radar contact following a sudden German turn to the east. For more than 31 hours, Bismarck's precise position remained uncertain. During this period, British command calculated multiple possible transit vectors toward Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire. Carrier-based air search from Victorious and Ark Royal expanded across sectors exceeding 600 nautical miles in width. Operational planning accounted for the known speeds of Bismarck at reduced output, British destroyer endurance limits, fuel reserves of pursuing capital ships, and the progressive narrowing of possible interception zones. German naval doctrine for surface operations emphasized avoidance of decisive fleet engagements in favor of attritional commerce disruption. However, the loss of operational secrecy and the destruction of Hood shifted the dynamic irreversibly. Bismarck now represented a high-value target whose survival or destruction carried strategic consequences beyond tonnage statistics. For Germany, safe arrival in France would preserve one of only 2 modern battleships available. For Britain, destruction at sea would eliminate a major surface threat and serve an operational deterrent function against future sorties. Both sides now faced logistical constraints. British destroyers required frequent refueling and were forced to rotate back to base. Several capital ships exceeded planned endurance limits while maintaining interception stations. German command lacked any reserve surface units capable of altering the campaign outcome. Luftwaffe units in western France prepared limited reconnaissance and eventual fighter coverage, but could not project air power securely over the open Atlantic. By the evening of 25 May, 9 separate British task groups operated in partially overlapping search sectors. These formations included over 35 major warships and more than 50 auxiliary escort vessels. German situational awareness deteriorated as British radio direction finding refined probable movement vectors using intercepted Kriegsmarine traffic. Although exact location remained unknown, British planners steadily compressed the possible operating area to a narrowing corridor southwest of Ireland. At this stage, the operation had fully transitioned from an offensive commerce raid into a constrained pursuit defined by geography, endurance, and interception timing. Bismarck's remaining path margins steadily contracted as British forces repositioned along the approaches to the Bay of Biscay. The outcome now depended less on initial firepower and more on whether detection would occur before German air cover could be established from occupied France. By the evening of 24 May 1941, the operational contact between the opposing forces had entered a new phase defined less by direct gunnery exchange and more by detection, air attack, and continuous maneuvering. Bismarck proceeded southward at an average speed of 20 to 22 knots, attempting to widen the distance from the British battleships while conserving fuel. The oil leak from the ruptured forward bunker remained visible from the air and continued to compromise concealment. German damage control teams worked to counter flood compartments to stabilize trim and to isolate compromised piping, but full containment of the fuel loss proved impossible. British command initiated air operations within hours of losing radar contact. At 22 on 24 May, aircraft from HMS Victorious launched the first carrier-based strike against Bismarck. The attacking force consisted of 6 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers from 825 Naval Air Squadron, operating at low altitude in night conditions. The aircraft approached through broken cloud cover at speeds below 220 km per hour. German anti-aircraft defenses, consisting primarily of 105 mm, 37 meters, and 20 mm batteries, engaged the attackers at ranges between 3,500 and 1,000 meters. At 23:30, at least 4 torpedoes were released. One torpedo struck Bismarck on the port side near the armored belt at frame 46. The explosion caused limited external damage due to the ship's layered torpedo defense system. Flooding was contained primarily to an outboard compartment and did not significantly degrade speed or structural integrity. Casualties from the air attack totaled 1 dead and 5 wounded. The remaining torpedoes either missed or detonated prematurely. All 6 British aircraft returned to Victorious, though several sustained structural damage from anti-aircraft fire. While the physical damage remained limited, the air attack imposed a strategic constraint. Bismarck was forced to maintain continuous zigzag maneuvers for several hours after the strike, reducing speed and complicating damage control operations. The psychological effect of confirmed carrier-based reach also eliminated any expectation that the battleship could transit the open Atlantic without sustained air threat. Throughout 25 May, intermittent air searches resumed from multiple British bases. Coastal Command aircraft from Northern Ireland and Western Britain conducted long-range patrols using Catalina and Hudson reconnaissance aircraft. At 10:30 on 25 May, a Catalina flying boat from 209 Squadron detected an oil slick approximately 690 nautical miles west of Brest, but failed to confirm the battleship visually due to cloud cover. At 18:10, another Catalina rediscovered Bismarck at a position approximately 700 nautical miles west-northwest of Brest, traveling on a direct southeasterly course at roughly 21 knots. This confirmed contact resolved the 31-hour uncertainty period. Within minutes, the position was transmitted to multiple British formations converging from the north, west, and south. At that moment, the closest heavy units were Force H from Gibraltar, consisting of the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the battlecruiser Renown, and the light cruiser Sheffield. This force operated approximately 120 nautical miles south of Bismarck's position and immediately adjusted course for interception. That evening, Ark Royal prepared a full-strength torpedo strike. At 20:47 on 26 May, the first wave of 15 Swordfish aircraft launched. Due to a navigation error, the strike group initially attacked HMS Sheffield, which had been shadowing Bismarck. Torpedoes were released at ranges under 1,000 meters. 11 of the torpedoes failed due to defective magnetic detonators, and the 4 that detonated struck no critical systems. Sheffield sustained no damage. A second strike force of 15 Swordfish launched at 21s after revised target identification. The aircraft approached Bismarck from multiple headings at altitudes below 50 meters. German anti-aircraft fire intensified as the aircraft entered effective battery range. At 21:05, several torpedoes were released from distances between 400 and 800 meters. 2 confirmed hits were recorded. One struck amidships on the port side with limited structural effect. The second struck near the stern on the port quarter at frame 10, directly adjacent to the rudder compartments. This hit proved decisive. The shock disabled both port and starboard rudders, jamming them at an angle of approximately 12 degrees to port. Attempts to center the rudders by mechanical and hydraulic means failed. Divers from the engineering crew attempted external access under difficult sea conditions, but were unable to break the jam. Bismarck retained propulsion on all four shafts, but could no longer steer effectively. With engines set at differential power, the battleship could only maintain broad circular movement at reduced forward progress. Casualties from the Ark Royal attack totaled 2 killed and 9 wounded. Structural damage remained localized, but the loss of steering eliminated the final margin of maneuver required to evade interception. Bismarck's heading drifted slowly northward, directly toward converging British battle formations. By 22:30 on 26 May, Bismarck's speed had fallen below 8 knots. German command transmitted a final situation report confirming immobilization of the steering system and projected contact with superior enemy forces by dawn. With no escort vessels, no air cover, and no functional rudder control, the battleship entered the final phase of the operation under conditions of certain interception. During the night of 26 to 27 May 1941, operational conditions shifted into a sustained close contact phase defined by continuous enemy presence, repeated attacks, and the progressive exhaustion of defensive resources aboard Bismarck. With both rudders jammed and steering control lost, the battleship maintained limited headway using differential thrust from its 4 propeller shafts. Average forward speed fluctuated between 6 and 8 knots. Attempts to fully arrest the rudder angle through internal mechanical means and external access operations failed. Seawater pressure, structural deformation, and vibration prevented effective cutting or manual realignment of control linkages. From 23:00 onward, British destroyer flotillas established continuous contact. The attacking group consisted primarily of HMS Cossack, Maori, Sikh, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer ORP Piorin. These vessels displaced between 1,800 and 2,500 tons each and carried 4 to 6 torpedo tubes per ship. The destroyers maintained contact distances ranging between 6 and 12 kilometers, alternating attack runs to avoid coordinated counterfire. At 0037 on 27th May, Piorin initiated the first close-range challenge at approximately 11 kilometers. Bismarck responded with secondary battery fire from 150mm mounts. Over the next 4 hours, at least 16 torpedoes were launched against the immobilized battleship from various bearings. Due to heavy sea state, reduced visibility, and intensive evasive maneuvering using engine thrust, nearly all torpedoes missed. One torpedo detonated near the starboard side at approximately 0245, producing limited flooding in an outer compartment without affecting propulsion or combat systems. Throughout the night, Bismarck's anti-aircraft and secondary batteries remained active. Ammunition expenditure during this period exceeded 20% of remaining shell reserves for the 105mm and 150mm guns. Fire control systems remained partially functional, though optical targeting was intermittently blinded by spray and darkness. German damage control teams operated continuously to maintain power distribution, contain progressive flooding, and preserve watertight integrity. Electrical generation fluctuated due to repeated shock effects from near misses. Crew endurance deteriorated under continuous action conditions. By early morning, over 95% of the ship's complement had been at combat stations for more than 48 consecutive hours. Food distribution ceased. Freshwater reserves were restricted to engineering compartments and medical stations. Internal communication systems remained functional, but increasingly degraded by vibration and power instability. British heavy units converged throughout the night. Battleships King George V and Rodney closed from the northwest at an average speed of 22 knots. King George V carried 10 356mm guns and displaced 42,237 tons standard, while Rodney, an older vessel, displaced 38,000 tons and carried 9 406mm guns. Supporting cruisers, Norfolk and Dorsetshire maneuvered to establish flanking firing positions. At 03 Orer, the surface intercept distance was reduced to under 40 nautical miles. German command transmissions continued intermittently. At 0056, a radio message confirmed that steering could not be restored and that engagement with multiple enemy units was unavoidable. Luftwaffe fighter coverage from western France remained outside operational range due to distance, cloud cover, and limited night interception capability. No surface reinforcements existed within feasible reach. Prinz Eugen, now operating independently over 300 nautical miles westward, could not rejoin due to fuel constraints and superior enemy presence. By 05 DER on 27 May, Bismarck's heading stabilized into a slow counterclockwise drift with minimal forward displacement. Sea state registered at force 6, with wave heights between 4 and 5 meters. Visibility improved moderately after dawn, allowing British gunnery units to acquire optical contact zones. German lookouts confirmed the presence of multiple enemy capital ships on the horizon shortly after Oetkars at ranges under 23 kilometers. At this stage, operational escalation had reached full saturation. Bismarck faced converging surface combatants with overwhelming numerical and caliber superiority, no functional maneuver control, diminishing ammunition reserves, cumulative structural stress, and no prospect of external support. The operational crisis now transitioned decisively from pursuit into imminent fleet engagement. By 0830 on 27 May 1941, visual contact between the opposing surface forces had been firmly established. Bismarck lay approximately 300 nautical miles west of Brest, maintaining a speed below 8 knots due to the jammed rudders and reliance on differential engine thrust. British battleships Rodney and King George V approached from the northwest on converging courses, accompanied by the cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire. The sea state remained at force 6 with wave heights near 4 meters, but visibility had improved enough for optical fire control to operate effectively. At 0847, Rodney opened fire at a range of approximately 21,000 meters using its forward 406 mm turret. King George V followed within seconds from a similar range. Bismarck returned fire with its forward 380 mm turrets, though accuracy was already compromised by the inability to maneuver and stabilize firing angles. Within the first 5 minutes, Rodney scored at least 2 confirmed hits. One shell struck the forward superstructure, destroying the main rangefinder and eliminating centralized fire control for the forward batteries. Another impact disabled one of the forward 380 mm turrets. By 0009-02, multiple heavy-caliber shells had struck the battleship. King George V achieved at least 4 confirmed 356 mm hits during this phase, damaging secondary gun mounts and disabling one of the remaining fire control positions. Bismarck's ability to return accurate fire rapidly degraded. The aft turrets continued firing intermittently, but were forced to rely on local control with limited targeting data. Shell splinter damage spread across the upper decks, severing communication cables and disabling exposed weapon systems. At 09:10, cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire closed to ranges under 15,000 meters and began engaging with 203 mm guns. Their fire further suppressed Bismarck's remaining secondary batteries. By 09:20, all major German optical directors were destroyed or inoperable. No confirmed German hits were recorded against any British heavy unit during this phase of the engagement. Between 09:20 and 09:35, Rodney advanced to within 9,000 meters, firing at a range that exceeded the effectiveness envelope of Bismarck's remaining damaged fire control systems. At least 3 406 mm shells penetrated the belt and upper hull during this interval. One shell entered the forward hull near the waterline, producing extensive flooding in multiple adjacent compartments. Another struck near turret Bruno, rendering it completely inoperable. The final operational main battery turret ceased firing at approximately 09:31. By this point, Bismarck's upper deck presented widespread structural destruction. Secondary armament had been largely silenced. All major fire control instruments were destroyed. After the destruction of all centralized fire control systems and the silencing of the main battery by approximately 09:31 on 27 May, Bismarck entered a phase in which organized resistance shifted from offensive combat to internal survival measures. With steering lost, propulsion limited to asymmetric engine output, and all primary weapons disabled, remaining operational capacity concentrated on damage containment, emergency evacuation readiness, and prevention of capture. At this stage, The ship still retained partial electrical power from auxiliary generators and maintained internal communication using isolated voice circuits and runners. Engineering teams continued to fight progressive flooding below the armored deck. At least 5 adjacent forward compartments were flooded from combined shell penetrations and torpedo shock effects. Pumping capacity was severely reduced as power fluctuations affected turbine-driven bilge systems. Counter-flooding operations were executed to limit hull distortion, but the loss of trim control continued to increase the port list, which exceeded 15 degrees by 10:30. Internal access between compartments became physically restricted as passageways deformed under structural stress. German naval protocol provided for destruction of sensitive equipment if capture became imminent. Beginning shortly after TENS, demolition teams initiated prepared scuttling procedures. Explosive charges were placed near key magazine spaces, turbine rooms, and selected hull compartments. C valves located below the armored citadel were manually opened where access remained possible. At least 5 major intake valves were confirmed open by engineering personnel in the forward and midship sections before internal flooding made further access impossible. Surviving crew members regrouped at designated evacuation stations. Due to the collapse of most davit structures from shell damage and internal fires, lifeboat deployment capacity was severely restricted. Of the original 8 large ship's boats, only 2 remained structurally deployable by late morning. Raft storage areas were largely destroyed by upper deck fires and secondary shell strikes. Life jacket distribution continued until internal supply lockers were inaccessible due to flooding. British surface units adapted their engagement posture once it became clear that Bismarck was no longer returning fire. King George V maneuvered to avoid collision risk in heavy sea state, while conserving ammunition after firing approximately 340 main-caliber rounds. Rodney continued intermittent fire against the unresponsive hull to accelerate structural failure. By 10:20, British commanders determined that further shell fire alone would result in slow sinking due to the ship's intact main belt and extensive compartmentalization. At 10:25, the cruiser Dorsetshire moved into torpedo attack position from the port quarter at a range of approximately 3,000 meters. 2 533 mm torpedoes were launched at close range. One struck aft near the already damaged steering compartments, and another struck amidships below the armored belt. Both detonations produced localized flooding below the armored deck and accelerated compartment interconnection. A third torpedo launched shortly afterward missed. At approximately 10:35, Dorsetshire repositioned to starboard and launched a further torpedo at a range under 2,500 meters. This weapon detonated forward, adjacent to previously flooded compartments, causing additional structural displacement along the port bilge. At this point, the combined effects of scuttling valves, shell damage, and torpedo flooding exceeded the reserve buoyancy of the forward half of the hull. German command personnel confirmed that all organized shipboard operations had ceased. At this stage, the ship could no longer maintain surface integrity under existing flooding rates. The final transition from combat asset to sinking hull occurred under combined effects of internal scuttling, structural collapse, and terminal torpedo penetration. The critical turning point of Operation Rheinübung occurred between 10:40 and 10:44 on 27 May 1941, when Bismarck transitioned irreversibly from a damaged but floating warship into a sinking hull. By this stage, the combined effects of shell damage, torpedo hits, and internal scuttling measures had eliminated the ship's remaining reserve buoyancy. Flooding below the armored deck expanded beyond the capacity of any remaining internal barriers. The forward compartments were fully compromised, and progressive flooding advanced aft through interconnected machinery spaces. At approximately 10:40, Bismarck's forward section submerged to the level of the main deck. The bow lost all positive buoyancy, and the ship's trim shifted rapidly forward. The port list increased beyond 25 degrees, causing loose internal debris, unsecured equipment, and collapsed deck fittings to slide toward the submerged side. Water entered through ruptured casemate gun ports and ventilator shafts, accelerating internal flooding of the upper levels. At this point, British surface units ceased all gunnery fire. King George V and Rodney disengaged to avoid the risk of collision and to conserve remaining ammunition. Dorsetshire maintained visual observation at a distance of approximately 4,000 meters. No further torpedoes were launched after 10:35. British commanders assessed that the ship no longer represented a combat threat and that structural failure was unavoidable under existing conditions. Between 10:42 and 10:43, Bismarck's forward superstructure disappeared below the surface. The forward turrets, already disabled, were submerged sequentially. As water entered the internal hull spaces at unequal rates, the battleship momentarily stabilized at an extreme port list before the center of gravity shifted beyond the stability limit defined by the remaining flooded compartments. Once this threshold was exceeded, righting moments were no longer sufficient to arrest the roll. At approximately 10:44, the hull inverted partially as the port side fell away beneath the waterline. The aft section remained visible for several seconds as the ship rotated. The propeller shafts continued rotating briefly due to residual steam pressure, before stopping as the engine rooms flooded. The stern then rose momentarily above the surface at an angle estimated between 30 and 40 degrees relative to the waterline. Within seconds, the aft section followed the bow underwater. The final visible structure was the starboard quarter of the stern, which submerged completely by approximately 10:45. The cruiser launched boats and threw flotation lines into the water while maintaining limited maneuvering speed to avoid collision with debris and potential underwater hazards. Over the next 25 minutes, Dorsetshire recovered 85 survivors. Several were wounded by shell splinters, burns, or broken limbs sustained during abandonment. Medical personnel aboard Dorsetshire treated these injuries under emergency conditions. HMS Maori, operating nearby, recovered 25 additional survivors. The total number of confirmed recoveries from the water reached approximately 110 men. At 11:25, rescue operations were abruptly terminated when sonar contact suggested the possible presence of a German submarine in the vicinity. This threat assessment, combined with standing operational orders, compelled British commanders to disengage immediately to prevent further losses. Hundreds of remaining survivors were left in the water when rescue efforts ceased. During transit, continuous anti-submarine precautions were maintained. No successful German submarine attacks occurred against withdrawing British units during this phase. Force H, including Ark Royal and Renown, resumed defensive patrol posture south of Ireland before returning to Gibraltar over the following days. German naval operations in the Atlantic were immediately altered following confirmation of Bismarck's loss. All remaining surface raider plans were suspended indefinitely. Prince Eugen, which had continued independent operations following detachment on 24 May, conducted no significant further commerce raiding success and returned to Brest on 1 June 1941 after experiencing mechanical issues. Within the German command structure, responsibility for the loss was formally acknowledged at the highest level. Grand Admiral Raeder reported the destruction of Bismarck directly to Adolf Hitler on 27th of May. As a direct consequence, Hitler issued strict restrictions on future surface fleet operations. Capital ships were no longer permitted to undertake independent Atlantic sorties without overwhelming escort and air cover. This decision effectively removed the German battleship force from meaningful offensive activity for the remainder of the war. British naval leadership conducted immediate after-action evaluations. The destruction of Hood earlier in the operation was formally investigated through gunnery analysis, shell trajectory reconstruction, and magazine safety review. This process led to modifications in deck protection procedures and ammunition handling safety across several British capital ships. The aftermath of the sinking produced no territorial change, no occupation phase, and no further surface engagement directly linked to the operation. However, the operational withdrawal phase formally concluded Operation Rheinübung as a completed naval failure for Germany and as a closed pursuit campaign for the Royal Navy. By the evening of 27 May 1941, British naval forces had fully disengaged from the area west of Brest. No German surface combatants remained operational in the North Atlantic at that time. The Atlantic surface threat posed by Germany's battleship fleet had been eliminated in a single campaign lasting 9 days from departure to sinking. The long-term consequences of Operation Rheinübung extended far beyond the loss of a single capital ship, reshaping German naval strategy, British maritime doctrine, and the balance of surface power in the Atlantic for the remainder of the war. With the sinking of Bismarck on 27 May 1941, Germany lost one of only 2 modern battleships completed at that time. The surviving sister ship, Tirpitz, remained operational, but was thereafter confined primarily to Norwegian waters under heavy Allied surveillance and continuous air threat until its destruction in November 1944. From a strategic perspective, Rheinübung marked the effective end of Germany's attempt to challenge British naval control through independent surface raiding by capital ships. Prior to May 1941, German surface forces had sunk approximately 754,000 gross register tons of Allied shipping through raider operations combined. After Bismarck's loss, surface sorties by heavy units were largely abandoned in favor of submarine warfare. From mid-1941 onward, U-boats became the primary German naval weapon in the Atlantic, reaching a peak operational strength of over 300 boats by 1943. The decision issued by Adolf Hitler following Bismarck's destruction imposed strict operational limitations on remaining surface ships. No German battleship or battlecruiser was authorized to undertake independent Atlantic raids again. Heavy units were instead assigned to defensive roles in the Baltic and Norwegian theaters. This strategic shift removed the threat of surface breakout entirely and allowed the Royal Navy to redeploy significant heavy units toward convoy escort, Arctic supply routes, and the Mediterranean theater. For the Royal Navy, the campaign produced systemic changes in interception doctrine, carrier integration, and final kill procedures. The decisive disabling of Bismarck by torpedo aircraft demonstrated the effectiveness of low-speed carrier aviation against heavily armored surface targets. Following Rheinübung, British naval planning increasingly prioritized continuous air coverage over distant surface interception. By 1943, every major Allied convoy route incorporated escort carrier protection as a standard measure. The loss of HMS Hood earlier in the operation triggered a comprehensive review of naval ammunition protection and deck armor across the British fleet. Post-battle analysis confirmed that Hood's deck protection was insufficient against long-range plunging shell fire. As a result, ammunition handling regulations were revised, magazine flood procedures were accelerated, and flash protection systems were standardized across multiple classes of British capital ships. These modifications directly influenced survivability in later naval engagements. In numerical terms, Operation Rheinübung resulted in the loss of 1 German battleship with a crew of 2,221, of whom approximately 2,100 to 2,150 were killed. British losses consisted of 1 battlecruiser, HMS Hood, with 1,418 crewmen, of whom 1,415 were killed, and damage to Prince of Wales that required several months of repair. No territorial gains resulted from the operation on either side. The campaign produced no sustained change in convoy losses during the following month, confirming that its strategic impact was centered on naval force composition rather than logistics disruption. The psychological and political effects were immediate. In Britain, the destruction of Bismarck functioned as a corrective event following the loss of Hood, restoring institutional confidence in the Royal Navy's ability to eliminate high-value threats through coordinated multi-force operations. In Germany, the loss undermined confidence in surface fleet employment and reinforced the strategic shift towards submarine warfare as the primary offensive instrument at sea. From a technological standpoint, Rheinübung demonstrated the limits of battleship survivability in the emerging environment of air power, radar tracking, and long-range coordination. The wreck of Bismarck, located in 1989 at a depth exceeding 4,700 meters, confirmed that structurally the hull remained largely intact below the armored citadel, validating post-war assessments that the sinking resulted from cumulative flooding combined with deliberate internal scuttling rather than direct catastrophic hull rupture. In the broader scope of the Second World War, the operation altered no territorial boundaries and did not directly affect the pace of land campaigns. Its historical significance lies instead in doctrinal transformation. Rheinübung conclusively demonstrated that surface capital ships operating without sustained air cover could no longer survive in contested maritime space. From May 1941 onward, the strategic era of the autonomous Atlantic battleship had effectively ended.